We are back live with a special episode of the CBB Central podcast. And today, the primary focus of the show is an idea that Brad brought up this offseason of, bringing the most surprising and most disappointing players in college basketball. We're both super excited about that, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But first off, we just wanted to touch on real quick the independent commission on college basketball headed up by Condoleezza Rice announced their report findings. I don't exactly know how they're referring to it, but there's some interesting stuff in there, so we figured we'd touch on that first. But first off, Brad, how are you doing, man? It's been a bit.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good, Kevin. No real complaints. Just want these transfer decisions to keep flooding in. We had a nice run on commitments today. In terms of this independent report, we had ton of people making these broad sweeping conclusions. Although I think the one biggest thing that was a huge negative part of the report that not enough people are talking about was they asked for freshman ineligibility, which I am not a fan of whatsoever. I don't remotely see the point of that. Anything else stick out to you in that report?
Yeah, the freshman ineligibility thing just seemed odd to me. Just because, I can understand people saying we want to get rid of the one and done. We really want kids, to stay for 4 years and play basketball, or stay for at least a couple of years and play basketball, and not, everyone turn into Duke and Kentucky. But at the same time, that idea doesn't make sense, and it's truly bad for business for college basketball. Are kids going to want what is the incentive that everyone has to sit out their first year? Would they only have 3 years of eligibility? I thought that plan was not all that clear. It's not been something that's brought up too much. I don't think most people expected to get full support by the NCAA. I thought overall, I saw a really good tweet from Jason Gay, who writes for the Wall Street Journal. He said, some good overdue change recommended. Still, it perpetuates a dubious premise that the NCAA is under siege by corrupt outside forces, which must be contained, instead of the truth, which is that the NCAA itself has created this climate. I think that's pretty fair. I think it summarizes everything, and the NCAA does. I think we've seen time and time again the NCAA doesn't care. I know in the report there was discussions of the NCAA, requesting shoe companies to open up their books if they're going to run, grassroots basketball, potential that USA Basketball could overtake the July AAU stuff and run that. There's all sorts of proposals out there right now. I don't know what will stick. I don't know that this system works. I think the shoe companies are dirty in this, but they're not the cause of this. The NCAA is the cause of this. And so, from my perspective, I don't think there was anything too revelatory in today's release. I was debating last night. I was like, do I need to wake up early? I'm on the Central Time Zone. It would have been a 7 a.m. wake up for me after going to bed at 2 the night before. So I decided against waking up, saw the news when I woke up around 9, and I wasn't too intrigued by it, to be quite honest. I thought most of it was fairly standard. I thought they made some good points. NBA draft, getting rid of the one and done is not their jurisdiction, but it's a good idea in my opinion. But as I said, I don't think there's anything too revelatory, but something we should discuss on the pod.
Yeah, that was something that I had mentioned, or I had wanted to mention first. When I first saw a tweet with the 4 takeaways from this, and the first one was they want the one and done rule gone. My immediate thought was, well, that's not their rule to change. That's the NBA's rule. I don't know exactly why the NBA instituted it. I know people were, or some people posit that it was to kind of save them from themselves and kind of get another year to evaluate a high school player against higher level competition. But I think it was more of the Players Association wanted less young players who weren't making an impact taking up a roster spot. So those are the two schools of thought there. But in terms of the changes overall, if you thought today that you were going to find out that the NCAA was going to start compensating players or allowing Olympic model or something, I think you were just fooling yourself. That way too optimistic for for April 25th. But the only two things that would worry me in terms of the future of college basketball would be eliminating the one and done rule and the G League raising their salaries into like the six figures or even seven figures, because that 35,000, which they just raised it from 27,000 to 35,000, isn't enough to get enough players, enough of the best players to leave college basketball for. So until both those things happen, I'm not too worried.
Yeah, I don't think it's anything to be worried about per se. I think college basketball will survive if a couple of one and done type talents want to go pro. And personally, I don't have a problem with that. Did we need Markelle Fultz in college basketball last season? Did we need Marvin Bagley this year or DeAndre Ayton? I think it's great to have and it provides great storylines, but college basketball will have stars. A Tyler Hansbrough or Grayson Allen, to me, is a much bigger star than a Marvin Bagley, a Markelle Fultz, a DeAndre Ayton. These guys who've developed these incredible storylines throughout their collegiate careers. I'm not concerned for the future of college basketball in that regard, as much as I think some people are. I don't think people watch college basketball, with the exception of a few NBA draft writers and people who are, big NBA fans who just watch in March just to watch the next generation of talent. I think they watch for, a whole host of reasons. And so that doesn't bother me too much. But overall, I don't think, as I said, nothing too crazy here. I thought it read for something that was supposed to be somewhat independent, it didn't read very independent. It felt very NCAA, sanctioned, approved, stamp of approval. This is what we're saying. We're just having Condoleezza Rice be the one who's delivering it. So, overall, like I said, I don't think there's anything too much to get into here from this early morning release.
Yeah, so transitioning into our next topic, the biggest star of college basketball season, this one and done talent, was both on our most surprising players list, and I think it's a good place to start off, and that's Trae Young. So Kevin, where did you rank Trae Young in terms of the most surprising players in college basketball? Because personally, I had him right at the top at number 1.
I put him at number 3. And I mean, in terms of going from 0 to hero, I think he probably is number 1. And just in terms of stature and the way ESPN, blew him up and things of that nature. But I did have 2 guys ahead of him, Keita Bates-Diop and Gene Penava. From Marshall, Penava literally came from like 0 production to like an NBA draft prospect, and Bates-Diop, who had kind of shown talent but never really put it all together in college, comes out Big Ten Player of the Year. And literally changes the complexion of his team from being predicted as one of the Big Ten's worst to a top 5 seed in the NCAA tournament, top 3 seed in the Big Ten. Just an incredible season from him. So those were the 2 guys that I put ahead of him. I will say it was really tough to rank these ones. Brad, you texted me, I think it was during the NCAA tournament, with this idea, and I was all over it. And then I sat down to do it, and I was like, dang, this is real hard. But it was a fun time putting the list together. I had Trae Young at number 3. Interested to see what your kind of top tier was, because I had that top 3: Keita Bates-Diop, Penava, Trae Young. And then to round out my top 5, I had James Palmer at Nebraska at 4, just because of his impact from role player at best at Miami to superstar in the Big Ten. And then number 5, I had Cameron Young, which is a name people probably don't know, but he played for Quinnipiac this season. And, one of the most incredible turnarounds in terms of statistical turnarounds I have ever seen by a basketball player. He played in 6 games, averaging 1.3 minutes per game for Quinnipiac as a junior, as a JUCO transfer. And then this season gets a new coach and a new system, averages 19 points, 7 rebounds, 3 assists, shoots 42% from the field, 30% from 3. Was pretty much a superstar in the MAC. Like, I would have voted him first team all league. It was kind of an incredible turnaround. So he was now number 5, as just completely out of the blue. Like, I barely knew his name.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had heard the name Cameron Young. If you had asked me what team he played for, I would have said Youngstown State, but I think that was Cameron Morse.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that says says everything right there. Oh, was he a senior?
Yes, he was a senior. He was a JUCO transfer, had 1 year where he didn't play, 1 year where he blew it up, and now he's gone.
Okay, yeah, because that would be a very interesting player to track next year. In terms of my top four was pretty much my top tier. It was all categorized by guys who all four of them were freshmen who were not necessarily NBA draft prospects coming into the year, but now if any of these four players would have been in the draft, they would have definitely been a first rounder, probably even top 20. So 2 through 4, I had Zaire Smith from Texas Tech, who was ranked in the low 100s, like close to 200 in the recruiting rankings. He's a terrific athlete, a good defensive player. Has kind of a weird jump shot, but it goes in enough to the point where he's a potential first round prospect in the wing. And I also had DeAndre Hunter from UVA, who redshirted last year as a true freshman, despite being like a top 70 recruit. This season, I expected him to have like a solid season as like a sixth man, but he emerged as like a real impact player at that power forward position in a smaller lineup for Virginia. And if he was not hurt, I think he potentially could have stayed in the draft, in which case he would have most certainly been a first rounder at that combo forward spot. And then lastly, in my top tier, I had Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who was like a top 30 recruit. The reason why I have him below Young, Smith, and Hunter is that he had some buzz coming into the year as kind of like a sneaky one and done, or like a sneaky breakout prospect. He's obviously has amazing size for a point guard at like 6'6". He can shoot the ball. I read, one of the most impressive things about him, which I didn't notice watching, was he can finish equally well with both his right and his left hand. And at 6'6", with that ability to play multiple positions, that's a huge attribute to have coming into the draft.
Yeah, I actually didn't put Hunter or Gilgeous-Alexander on my list. For Hunter, I was very high on him coming into the year. I think he certainly could have been on the list because he definitely exceeded my expectations. Same with Gilgeous-Alexander. But I didn't feel like maybe they came quite so out of nowhere. I had Zaire Smith and Jarrett Culver together on my list at number 7. Both guys were terrific, and obviously Smith got a lot of the headlines, but Culver's, a foundational piece now for Texas Tech going forward. He gets overlooked, but the numbers he put up this season: 11 points, 5 rebounds. He's so long and athletic. He showed the ability to hit the 3-point shot at 1.5 threes a game at 38% clip. Very solid. It's got to get the free throws up a little bit at 65%. I love the defensive upside with his length. He's just kind of the perfect player for Chris Beard. Came on towards the end of the season as well, which you always like to see with a freshman. If you look at the final bit of games for Jarrett Culver, the final 15 games of the season, he upped those numbers by about a point or two a game, upped those rebounds by about two boards a game, shot about 40% from 3, had some pretty monster games, had 26 and 12 against West Virginia in the regular season finale, a 20-point ball game against Texas Christian, TCU. So the future's certainly bright for Jarrett Culver at Texas Tech.
Yeah, so I think now would be a good time to point out the players who are on both of our lists. So obviously we mentioned Trae Young and Zaire Smith. We also had Jared Culver. I had Culver at number 13, so I had him a bit lower than you. I also had James Palmer, who you mentioned earlier, from Nebraska. I had him at number 19. I actually thought he was going to have a really nice season. I thought he could be like a double-figure scorer. But I saw him as more of like a 12 or 13 point per game guy. Then he was up around 20 points per game. In hindsight, I really like my list of guys. I kind of wish I put Penava on there. And yeah, he's probably the guy that I think I missed on the most. And then the final player who's on both of our list is Cassius Robertson, the point guard / shooting guard. From Missouri by way of Canisius. Robertson was a graduate transfer. I thought he was going to fit into the starting lineup as more of like a supplemental piece, but he was a real kind of a go-to offensive contributor. Handled the ball a lot, took a lot of big shots. Was a main focal point of the offense. So that was a very surprising aspect of a Missouri season for me.
Yeah, Cassius was a guy I'd watched, very closely for the first 3 seasons of his career. As a, huge fan of MAC basketball. Saw him at Canisius. He was a kid who could absolutely, light it up from downtown when he got cooking. But I saw him as really just that. He had almost no control in his game. Almost played like J.R. Smith at times. I remember one game I watched him. He scored like 14 points to start the game. He scored Canisius' first 14, and I think he finished the game with 16. He was just kind of a chucker, didn't do much, had oftentimes clashed with the coaching staff on one occasion that I recall. He was a guy who I wasn't necessarily as high on the transfer market. I thought he was maybe like an 8-10 type piece if he wanted to play significant minutes, but he couldn't have really found a better landing spot than Mizzou. And he was a star this year. He was legitimately awesome, and it was great to see for a senior. He made himself a lot of money this season professionally, which is huge for him, going forward. And I think he's kind of the perfect example of what the grad transfer role is all about. Great to see, certainly. And as you said, one of the most surprising, I had him at number 6. What number did you have him at, Brad?
I had him at number 10.
Good stuff.
It's pretty similar.
So I also, one thing I did was I had a pretty good amount of mid-major guys, not necessarily surprising coming from me. But here's a couple mid-major guys I figured we should bring up. I had Nick King at number 8. Obviously at Middle Tennessee State, put it all together this year. Everyone knew he had the talent, but finally does put it together this season. Averaged just, I think, over 20 points a game, about 8 to 10 rebounds. I had Vasa Pusica at Northeastern. He was a guy who averaged like 5 or 6 points a game as a sophomore at San Diego, transfers to Northeastern, and was like legitimately a CAA Player of the Year candidate. He was just superb. He's going to be even better next year, so a guy to watch out for sure. Also had RJ Cole at number 15, averaged 23 points and 6 assists as a freshman at Howard. Kind of like the freshman that no one knows about, who is just bonkers good, who could like set some scoring records if he stays 4 years at Howard, which I don't know if he will, but it would be fun. And then I had another freshman, Terry Taylor at Austin P, averaged 15 points and 8 rebounds, shooting 50% from the field, 40% from 3, and 75% from the free throw line at 6'5". I think he's like a legit, like sneaky NBA prospect. Certainly a really big talent for Matt Figure out at Austin P. I also had Emmett Narr at number 16, the senior point guard at St. Mary's. He's a guy who probably wouldn't make most people's list. He's only on mine because I was super down on Emmett Narr coming into the year. And had kind of a disappointing season. Really came on though this year. Looked a lot better as a distributor, as a pure passer. I really enjoyed watching him play this year. And then one more mid-major player. The 2 players, actually, I grouped the Martins together. I was pretty high on them, but they exceeded my wildest expectations. They were just superb.
Yeah, looking at your list, I think the one player that I miss, or the one of like the few players that I am really kicking myself for not including, was Cody Martin, because I thought he was just going to be a role player at Nevada, but he's even like an NBA prospect now. He's on NBA top 100 prospect lists. So that was quite the transformation. In terms of mid-major players myself, I didn't have too many. I had a few guys that were former mid-major players, but I did have one from the Atlantic 10 in Courtney Stockard from St. Bonaventure. He's a guy who I think he missed the past 2 seasons with injuries. I think this was his first time playing in like 3 years. And he made such a huge impact. He averaged double figures in those NCAA tournament games. He was huge, especially in the play-in round. And there was even some doubt that he was even going to be able to play because he hurt himself in the Atlantic 10 tournament. But he had an excellent season, and I think he's back for next season. I've seen conflicting reports about that, but I'm pretty sure he is back. Another player
he's eligible, but there's been some reports of the grad transfer, him going pro. His stock's pretty high right now, so he might just try to capitalize on that. But as of now, he is planning to be a backup Bonaventure from what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean he would be one of if not the best grad transfer wing on the market. So he will definitely have a market if he chooses to leave. And another guy from outside the Power Five that or the Power Six that I had was Corey Davis from Houston. I didn't know much about Davis coming into the year. I just knew he was a JUCO transfer. But he established himself as like the starting wing or like starting shooting guard for Houston. He shot the ball extremely well, and I expect him to have a more substantial role, more starring role this year with Rob Gray out of the picture. And I also just wanted to bring up my second tier in my rankings was kind of categorized by people who I was dead wrong on, guys who vastly exceeded my expectations, even though that they're not really stars in college basketball. So I'll just run through these quick because I've been talking for a while. But the first one is Martin Krompel from Creighton. When I watched him last season, I mean he was totally unplayable. He was getting killed in the pick and roll. This year he was one of the best big men in the Big East, and he's probably Creighton's best player if Kyrie Thomas goes pro. Second, Phil Kofer from Florida State went from like a two point per game guy to like I think 13 or 14 points per game. He added a ton to his perimeter game. He's become a legitimate skilled stretch four. Then I had Nick Babb from Iowa State, who partway through the non-conference transitioned to the point guard position, where he thrived and really changed Iowa State's future outlook, especially for next season. I think that they're a very undervalued team right now nationally. I think that they could reasonably be in the top 25 if Lindell Wigginton returns. And Babb is probably the main reason as he's getting stability to the point guard position. And then I had Admiral Schofield from Tennessee, went from kind of a bulky, undersized power forward, made a full transition to the wing where he added a lot of skill, and he's actually a sneaky NBA draft prospect. And lastly, to end my rant, O'Shea Brissett from Syracuse. I thought he'd be like a nice role player, but he was legitimately very, very good, very, very aggressive player who can also shoot the ball for Syracuse.
Yeah, some really excellent points in there. I'll touch real quick, as you mentioned, a Syracuse guy. I had a different Syracuse guy on my list. I had Frank Howard. Frank Howard had kind of been pretty much hated by Syracuse fans. People like Frank Howard stinks. Most people, I think, in the media were very concerned about Frank Howard. He had a really good year. Obviously, he's not a perfect player. He's not a superstar by any means, but to have the year he had, I believe he averaged about 14 points a game, about 4 assists. He's long. He made some big shots for them, and obviously he's not the superstar point guard that Syracuse wants. And Tyus Battle had a great year, and Brissett had a good year, but they needed him to be as sound as he was for the most part this season. So I threw him on my list at number 11. There was a couple of guys you mentioned that I look back and kind of kick myself for not including. I was really impressed. I'm blanking on who it was now. I'm losing my train of thought here. But there's a bunch of like kind of Power 5 names that I was like, wow. Like when you mentioned them, I kind of had lost them in my memory for whatever reason. What was that?
Nick Babb?
Yeah, that was who I wanted to mention with Babb. Nick Babb. Because I forgot, I had like discussed him in my head. I was like, he's for sure going on my list, and then somehow did not make his way onto his list because he's just so important to what they do. Because he's big and he can kind of play the 2 defensively, but he can run the show. Let Lindell Wigginton kind of score the ball off the bounce. Kind of similar in a way to what Canada did. I don't know how much you watched FIBA U19 last year, but where Canada would give the ball to RJ Barrett, let him run a lot of the offense, and let Wigginton kind of flash off the ball a lot of times and score the basketball. They did a similar thing at Iowa State with Babb. I think it's a perfect fit. They can do that even more next year with Talon Horton-Tucker coming in, who's kind of a point forward from Simeon. In Chicago, he's a super talented kid they're really high on. So you'll have 2 guys who are not the point guard, like Wigginton, to who can just go to work off the bounce, create mismatches. I'm super high on this Iowa State team next year, and Nick Babb is a huge reason why. Thanks for the state.
Yeah, prior to this season, like in the preseason, a lot of people had Iowa State in like their top 50s and stuff, and I was like vehemently, tweeting at people like, no, Iowa State is by far the worst team in the Big 12. I actually predicted that they would go 4-14, but I am not considering myself to be completely correct on that prediction, because I think that they were a lot better than I anticipated, and I think if they didn't suffer some injuries, they could have gotten maybe 6 or even 7 Big 12 wins, and it was all directly correlated to when they moved Donovan Jackson to the wing and slotted Babb in there at the point guard. And then you mentioned for next season they have Talen Horton-Tucker. They also have Mario Shayok, who's played for Virginia. He'll have 1 year of eligibility for Iowa State. He's a very good wing. And they have like a ton of good big men. They have Solomon Young and Cameron Laird, who played this year. And then Michael Jacobson, former Nebraska center. I don't know how all that's going to shake out, but they have a ton of different options and a ton of talented players. I just wanted to mention a few other guys on my list. You think that I should just like complete my list now, Kevin, or should I shoot it back to you? What do you think here for a strategy?
Why don't you wrap up your list? I will point out one statistic real quick on Nick Babb as we were mentioning him. He was the only player in the country this season to average at least 11 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 6.5 assists. And he did so, somewhat efficiently. Shot 45% from the field, 32% from three, which isn't ideal, but it can work. You can live with that. He cleaned the offensive glass, and when you have a guy who's such a good passer cleaning the defensive glass, it's so valuable because he can then push the ball in that system when they do run a run. Obviously not the same as having a Georges Niang, having a true point forward, but to have a guy who can do it all, can switch ball screens, who can go rebound, who can go push the break is just so valuable, and they'll have 2 of those guys with Talen Horton-Tucker and Babb next season.
Okay, so finishing off my list, I had number 11 on my list with Barry Brown from Kansas State. Went from a solid starter to like a go-to player and a guy who potentially could be first team all Big 12, maybe even a favorite for Big 12 Player of the Year if he chooses to return. Kansas State is a legitimate top 14, top 12 team. They are very experienced and very deep for next season. Number 12, I had Jalen Hudson. Transfer from Virginia Tech to Florida. He was just like a 7 or 8 point per game guy at Virginia Tech. I thought he would play a similar role at Florida, but he established himself as well as an NBA prospect. He's one of the, I think, most under-discussed but very important NBA draft decisions out there. I think with him, Florida is definitely a top 25 team. And then 14 through 16, I had Tremont Waters, Jalen Noel, and Markel Johnson. Waters and Noel had very strong freshman seasons. Definitely outperformed their rank. Noel was like top 50-ish. Waters was about top 40-ish. And both LSU and Washington should be top 25 teams, in my opinion, next year. And then Markel Johnson was a guy who, when I watched him as a freshman, he was completely out of control. I thought, and NC State's in a lot of trouble for this year. But, I mean, he made such a turnaround. He is a legitimate quality point guard, very athletic, makes great decisions, can drive the ball, great passer. And then lastly, at number 18 on my list, I had Bryce Brown from Auburn, similar to Barry Brown, kind of went from a solid starter, kind of supplementary piece to a legitimate all-league player on a very good team.
Yeah, it's a really solid list. I'll kind of run through mine. I know I had kind of skipped around with all the mid-major guys I wanted to bring up, but I'll run through the rest of the guys I haven't mentioned. I had Luke May at number 9. Didn't touch on him. He had a really good year for them. He was just super valuable. And I didn't know what to expect from him coming into the year, but he was a legit All-American type player. Sagaba Kanate I had at number 12. He's a guy who I think when I looked back at the numbers yesterday, I said maybe I shouldn't have been as surprised as I was by the production leap, because he kind of just stayed on mostly on track from what he had done the previous season. But he kind of came out of nowhere. He wasn't a name that I really was familiar with coming into the season. Certainly familiar with him now. A big draft decision coming up for him as well. A few more names that I had on my list. I had I had the duo of Deshaun Murray and Anthony McLemore. The Auburn front court was kind of in shambles coming into the year. Those two guys come in. McLemore having played 1 year with Auburn previously. Murray had sat out the previous season. Neither guy had too much fanfare about them, but they were massive in terms of defensively, in terms of effort and hustle and rebounding. And they made this team work, and that's why I'm kind of concerned losing Deshaun Murray, replacing with Austin Wiley. I don't think it's such an easy transition as a lot of people think, because this team was built as we have lots of really good guards who can go get a bucket, and we have two bigs who just bring energy and catch lobs and post up a little bit and do a lot of different things on the floor. So losing Murray and McLemore recovering from the injury will be interesting to watch. I always thought they were super surprising, super impressive. A couple more names that I had: Jesse Govan, I had on my list. Blew up, was a superstar this year for Georgetown. And finally, last but not least, at number 20, I had Juwan Morgan from Indiana. He was really good this year. And one thing we'll do, just so you don't have to try to keep track of everything in your head, I think we'll both tweet out our full lists with the podcast link, or at least parts of the list, so you guys can kind of see those and then follow along on the podcast as we do jump around a little bit. I think that'll probably simplify some things.
Yeah, that's a great idea there. Just Sagaba Konate, I had him on one. So obviously I went through every team, every relevant team, and kind of picked out a bunch of players, and I had obviously way more than 20. So I made a first cut and got to like 27, and then I made that second cut to get to 20. Konate was one of the people lost in the first cut. I'm not exactly sure why I did that because he certainly had a extremely surprising transformation. I would say you had Nick King and Frank Howard on your list. They were one of the people that got cut in my second round of cuts. And then you, I'm a blank, and there was someone that you had mentioned that I wanted to reiterate, but I don't remember. It wasn't Deshaun Murray.
Let's see. Govan?
No, there was one other, I think.
Juwan Morgan.
Juwan Morgan, that was it. I really liked Juwan Morgan coming into the year, but I didn't expect him to take such a offensive jump. I thought he would be more of like that role player, kind of point forward type. But he's a very promising prospect for next season if he returns to Indiana. So did you want to move on to the top 20 disappointing players?
Yeah, let's do it. I thought that was a harder list than I thought it would be to make, Brad.
It was.
I thought there was more in my head, like, of guys you would think of were disappointing. And I was like, I kept justifying guys' as disappointments in my head. Like, there was a reason why, like, it wasn't their fault type of thing. I didn't want to throw anyone under the bus, but I did come up with a pretty decent list. I'll start with my number one, Hamidou Diallo. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. He just wasn't a very good basketball player this season. After most people thought, he'd be a first-round pick if he had left today for the draft. Who'd you have at number one, and then you can kind of give me your first tier.
Okay, so number one, I actually had in a tier of his own, and that was Abdul Malik Abu from NC State.
I missed him.
He was a guy who. All right, so I'm a Providence fan, and he was one of the most coveted recruits for Providence in the last 10 years maybe. Coach Cooley really wanted him. They ended up missing out, so I followed his career really closely, and he had his worst statistical season this year out of all 4 years, and it got to the point towards the end of the season he was not even playing, and his style of play, you would think he would be the perfect big man for Kevin Keats, kind of in the role of Devontae Kaycock, but he was I would say he's a much better player than Kaycock. but he had totally struggled to find the floor. Played mostly power forward. Never really developed too much past being like a terrific athlete. It's it's a shame because by all accounts he's like a really great kid, like a really great well, I mean, I shouldn't say kid, he's probably my age, but like a really great person, high character person. But I was just disappointed that I thought he could take the next step and average 14, 15 points per game this year.
Yeah, Boo just slipped through the cracks for me. I mean, I thought I was super high on his ability to come into that system and succeed. I was low on Omer Yurtseven, who was a tough cut for me, actually, on my surprising, because I just thought the system fit was so perfect. And it just didn't work out for whatever reason. I guess him and Kevin Keats maybe didn't get along as well as you might have hoped. But yeah, really just tough season. I'll give you kind of my top 5. Actually, got my top 6 because that would be a tier for me. Number 1, I said Hamidou Diallo. Number 2, Robert Williams. Just never really put it together this season, which is a big disappointment for me. Number 3, Jaren Simmons at Michigan. Tough to call someone that disappointing when your team nearly wins the national championship, but everyone kind of expected so much out of Jaren Simmons. He didn't really produce. Number 4, Trayvon Duval. And number 5, Deng Adel. I'm probably way higher a disappointment on Deng Adel. Maybe I just heard too much hype about Deng Adel, and then he didn't kind of live up to it. I never turned on Louisville and was like immediately impressed by Deng Adel. I was like usually just underwhelmed by his performance. So maybe it's a little biased on my part, but overall, I was not a Deng Adel fan this season.
No, Deng Adel was a very good pick because coming into the year, I had seen him as more of like a potential combo forward, but he's like very much a wing, and he's very much like he just kind of puts his head down and drives. He really didn't take the step forward that a lot of people thought. And in terms of on who is on both of our lists, so I had Trayvon Duval. Obviously, I had him at number 2. I also had Jaren Simmons at number 3, so I think we had the same exact ranking for Simmons. Just a total disappointment. I thought he was going to be their starting point guard and put up pretty big numbers. He had a pretty accomplished career at both Houston and Ohio, but fell into the doghouse early and was overtaken by Xavier Simpson as a starting point guard for Michigan. I had Hamidou Diallo at number 10. Why I had him lower than I think most people would was, at least he was still playing, and at least his stats still looked okay. I looked at him earlier. They were like 10 points a game. I think coming into the year, you would think like maybe between 12 and 14. So like he was obviously a disappointment, but there are a lot of other guys on my list who like their stats were just completely either tanked or completely non-existent. In terms of other guys who we had on both of our lists, Zarius Williams from Dayton. He was one of my potential breakout players coming into the year. He was a complete non-factor. His points and rebounds dropped, and he is a sit one, play one transfer now at Akron. So that'll be an interesting player to watch, see if he can bounce back in that 1920 season. We also had Josh Braun, who I think struggled being the go-to guy for Grand Canyon with Russell out of there. His points per game went down, and his shooting percentages went down significantly. I thought he could potentially have a breakout season in the WAC. I think Grand Canyon as a team was a little disappointing as well. And then that was it, because it was a Simmons, Josh Braun, Hamidou Diallo, Trayvon Duval, Marcus McDuffie, and Zarius Williams were the ones that we had the same.
Yeah, I'll touch on the two at the end you mentioned of Zarius Williams. Dayton fans came into the year singing Zarius Williams praises, and that now they really dislike Zarius Williams for whatever reason. I think he had effort issues. I don't think he really vibed well with Anthony Grant. Regardless, the transfer, not a surprise. He kind of got benched by the end of the year. He has talent, though. Braun, I think there was an issue with Grand Canyon's overall roster construction. I touched on this on Twitter a couple of times. Dan Marley built this roster around two guards who aren't necessarily distributing guards who can't beat a man off the dribble. Casey Benson wasn't blowing by guys in the WAC. Like, came from Oregon, still wasn't blowing by guys in the WAC. Josh Braun, his knee surgeries have very much limited his mobility. He was not a guy who was really creating anything off the bounce. And then, so those were your two primary offensive creators. Your third offensive creator was Oscar Freyer, who could do a lot off the bounce, but couldn't shoot a lick. Keontae Vernon couldn't shoot a lick as their four-man. And then they had a stretch five in Alessandro Lever, who showed a lot of upside. But it was just like a very poorly kind of lined up roster for Grand Canyon. I don't think it was necessarily Dan Marley's fault. When you can get Casey Benson, you take him. When you can get Josh Braun, you obviously keep him. It was just there was a piece missing all year in that kind of scoring guard creator role. I wanted Damari Milstead to get more minutes. He never really did. Dwayne Russell, they missed him a lot more than I think anyone really ever imagined. Marcus McDuffie was on my list. I had one at number 7 as kind of a tandem. I did a couple of tandems. And that tandem was Bryant McIntosh and Scotty Lindsey at Northwestern. Both players' numbers went down this season. Both guys, there was chemistry issues on this Northwestern team. To have two seniors leading a team that was expected to be a top 20 team, not make the NCAA tournament, and have chemistry issues in their senior season is a major disappointment. I would feel like, so I had him. I had that pairing as kind of like an interesting grouping it's kind of the next year disappointing. Also, John Petty from Alabama. Everyone discussed Petty and Colin Sexton being the next Malik Monk and De'Aaron Fox. Well, if Colin Sexton was De'Aaron Fox, John Petty was nowhere close to Malik Monk. It was a rough year for him.
Yeah. I actually remember hearing that stuff in the preseason too about how amazing John Petty was, how he was this knockdown shooter, how he was super athletic. And I think I wouldn't say that his draft value is gone. I think a strong season next season could certainly put him back in the discussion. I actually had one of his teammates as number 5 on my list, and that's Braxton Key. He was someone who I was very high on coming into the year. He missed the first part of the year with a knee injury. I think it was a knee injury, but injury nonetheless. And he never really found his groove and is now transferring. And that's a shame because Alabama could have put in a crazy versatile lineup with all these like 6'5" to 6'8", like super athletic wings. They could have played like 5 of them at once. But now with Key gone, that's kind of off the table. He's more of a point forward type, but I thought he would still maintain a high level of production. But I don't even think he was in the starting lineup by the NCAA tournament. I'm not 100% sure on that, but overall a very disappointing year for Braxton Key. And then on another guy, kind of similar to who we mentioned, you had Deng Adele. I actually had VJ King on my list, another guy that I thought would take a step forward and break out, but he had pretty low shooting percentages. They were both in 30s, and then averaged like 8 or 9 points a game. He's someone who I think will be on a ton of breakout player lists for next season, and he may even be on my own breakout player list. But overall, just didn't take the step where a lot of people had him as like a preseason first round draft pick, but he was nowhere near that.
Yeah, definitely. VJ King got kind of on the John Rothstein bandwagon. John Rothstein, I kept seeing like all offseason, it would be like someone would tweet about Louisville, and Rothstein would be like, "Don't forget about VJ King." VJ King. Everything was like always VJ King, and he averaged like 8 points a game. He was just kind of very disappointing. I had Michael Porter on my list. I didn't really know how else to put it other than it was disappointing. Obviously, his injury wasn't his fault, but it still stunk. I had a guy at number 4, way up at the top, that I didn't mention, was Mark Smith. Not number 4, it was number 6, correction. That's Mark Smith out of Illinois. Everyone was like, he's the next Thomas Walkup, and he was just not good. He transfers to Mizzou. I'm still not super high on his game. He's basically a 2 guard who can't shoot or a point guard who doesn't distribute well. It's kind of a tweener, and it's concerning to me, but certainly has some upside still. Was a top recruit, big for Brad Underwood that he got him, but then couldn't hold on to him. Not really surprising. Trent Frazier had kind of taken over that role of ball dominant guard.
Yeah, that was a very good one. I mean, he was one of, if not the biggest late stock riser. He went from like a completely unknown recruit into like the top 60, and then obviously failed to make an impact at Illinois. we'll see next season if he can on Missouri. The next highest player on my list who we have not talked about was Derek Thornton, who I had number 4. He was someone who I thought was going to be the single best transfer in the country, but he had some injuries early. But even before that, he just wasn't performing even at the same level he did at Duke. I think a lot of people think of his Duke time as a disappointment as well, but he actually averaged like 8 or 9 points per game, I think, at Duke. This season, he was at like 3 or 4 points per game. He should be the starting point guard next season, so he'll have an opportunity to recoup his value. But overall, my impression of him was he was going to be like a 6th man on like this top 10 USC team this year, and both aspects of that just did not come to be.
Yeah, I was looking for a USC guy to kind of put on there, and I really couldn't kind of determine it. There were so many issues with that team. I didn't want to blame any one player for what a mess it was. I nearly just said USC and called it a day. But that team it stunk because they were so talented, just never came together for Andy Enfield. Obviously had FBI stuff hanging over their head. I'll do my thing of running through my mid-major guys. Just that I want to mention. We already touched on Josh Braun. I also had Chima Maneke from UC Davis. His production on the floor was very good when he played, but then a senior on a team that was the best team in his conference gets kicked off the team in February for still unknown reasons, the violation of team rules. He was kicked off on a road trip. It was very strange. Just absolutely just mind-boggling stuff that would happen to a senior star. Just so disappointing. Josh Ayeni from St. Bonaventure. I had St. Bonaventure fans in my mentions all preseason telling me how Josh Ayeni was a next grade at St. Bonaventure. He had so much upside as this 6'9" kid who could kind of step out and shoot a little bit, who could post up. And he averaged, I think, like 6 points, was injured a little bit, was in trouble a little bit, kind of went into Mark Schmidt's doghouse, just not a good season. Nico Clareth at Siena at 15. Had to shout out Siena, my hometown school. But Nico came in with all these expectations. Jimmy Patrick said he'd shoot 20 times a game. And Nico kind of fell back into old ways. He's a talented kid, but he's never really ever put it together. And so it's tough to see that. And so you hope that he can put it together his senior year. Right now, he's slated to sit out next season and transfer, but it's also possible that he could come back to Siena for 1 year, depending on who the new coach is. One more mid-major guy was a pairing. I had Kevin Hervey and Eric Neal. Those guys produce like crazy, but an underwhelming UT Arlington team overall. When you have 2 senior leaders, obviously the goal is to make the NCAA tournament. They couldn't make it happen. Wound up 4th in their conference. May have led to Scott Cross's firing, although that wasn't deserving anyway, so I don't really want to touch on that too much. But that was kind of my group of mid-major guys to contribute to the conversation.
So I had a few mid-major guys in Josh Braun and Zarius Williams. I also had one other one that we have not mentioned yet, and that's Cullen Neal. Cullen Neal was the first ever double grad transfer, going from New Mexico. Then he grad transferred to Ole Miss, and then grad transferred again last season to St. Mary's. And the role that Jordan Ford played, being that double-figure kind of score off guard, that was the role I thought Cullen Neal was going to play on the St. Mary's team. But he was kind of relegated to a reserve role, and every time I watched St. Mary's, he was not playing very well. So it's just a total kind of catastrophic drop from Neal. Like his numbers was down, his playing time was down, and watching him on the court was not very pretty. 2 other guys in that same sort of vein with the numbers going down. One was Kayvon Allen from Florida. A lot of people had him as like a SEC Player of the Year level player, but he kind of regressed a bit to just kind of like a above average starter. Hopefully next season where he will have more offensive responsibility, maybe we'll see a jump from him. And then another guy whose numbers were down, and actually the idea for this podcast came from me watching this guy in the NCAA tournament. That is Jaquan Newton from Miami, who went from a like quality point guard starter to like a seldom used reserve, and then with a couple injuries, he was moved back into like a more prominent role for Miami. But overall, he went from like 14 points per game to like 8 points per game. Lost that starting point guard job to Chris Likes. Just never really made any progress in his senior year in what should have been like a very strong season. Someone who averages 14 points per game as a junior on a very good Miami team, you expect a certain level of production from.
Yeah, absolutely. Newton was a big disappointment for me. He was a guy who I kind of saw coming as a disappointment just because I'd seen the assist-to-turnover ratio wasn't very good. He was basically a six-man playing point guard, and I said on a good team that's not going to work, and it didn't. Chris Likes, I'm super high on, though, so I thought it was kind of a blessing in disguise for Miami. That was big time. I would say I definitely liked some of those guys you had listed. One more guy I had on there was Kane Broom. We've kind of discussed him on the podcast once or twice before. He was a guy who a lot of people hyped up, but he had a tough year. He wasn't really the guy. He was really a six man, which is what I kind of told everyone he'd be, and people yelled at me, and I was kind of right on that one. But I still put him down on the disappointing list.
Yeah, Broom was certainly a disappointment. Because I remember hearing Cincinnati fans talk about how great that their team was going to be, and one of their reasons that they cited was Kane Broom, kind of dismissing the impact that Troy Copain had. And while Cincinnati was a awesome team this year, it had really nothing to do with the point guard spot. That was their Achilles heel. And actually, in the game against Nevada, where they couldn't get a quality shot down the stretch, a lot of that was on the shoulders of Broom and Justin Jennifer. For next season, maybe both those guys play together in like a very small backcourt. Maybe playing Broom off the ball will free him up. But certainly he's a player to watch next year. Three guys that I didn't group together in the rankings. One, because I was so much higher on this first guy, was Dominic Olejniczak for Ole Miss. So actually, my first article that I wrote for Busting Brackets this year was how it was in like early August, and it was how I thought Ole Miss was going to be an NCAA tournament team. Because I just love their talent. I heard great things about Olejniczak. He had his stats went up dramatically the second half of the season at Drake, which is where he transferred from. They had Bruce Stevens, they had Terrence Davis, they had DeAndre Burnett. They had all this talent, but they just couldn't put it together. And Olejniczak just looked like a very ordinary big man, averaged like 4 and 3 for Ole Miss. That was pretty disappointing. And then two other guys who, just nothing out of these two. Austin Grandstaff and Harry Frawling. Austin Grandstaff, former top 50 recruit, was at Ohio State, then transferred to Oklahoma, where he left Oklahoma before even playing a game, went to DePaul. And I thought, DePaul rolling the dice on this former top 50 recruit, it's a good move. Maybe he'll average 8 to 10 points a game, hit some threes. It'll be a nice addition. He was unplayable. He wasn't even in the rotation for most of the season for DePaul. Just a complete kind of wasted roll of the dice there. And then Harry Frawling from Marquette. He left SMU after half a year because of his role. Everyone in the preseason hyped up Frawling. Everyone talked about how he's in much better shape. He's so skilled. He's going to give Marquette this great dimension. And I fell for it hook, line, and sinker, and he stunk and was out of the rotation by the end of the season. He was playing behind both Matt Held and Theo John.
Yeah. I will say I did not have Grandstaff on my list, mostly because I had no confidence in Austin Grandstaff. He's on his third college, and he's still never really ever found a rotation piece. I think it's kind of safe to say he's a bust at this point.
Oh yeah.
So I never really believed in him. So I wasn't too disappointed because I didn't have any expectation, but certainly a fair inclusion on the list. The final guy that you have that I haven't mentioned, I had Joe Toy from Vanderbilt. He was a guy who everyone kind of hyped up as a breakout guy. Just never really put it together. Jeff Roberson had a big year, but Toy was very quiet.
So is that the last guy on your list that we haven't mentioned?
Yes, indeed.
Right, so I have 4 more, so prepare for another rant. We have Justin Jackson from Maryland. He's a guy who I thought was going to play his way into being like a top 20 NBA draft pick coming into the year, but he only played not even probably half the season before getting injured. He is in this NBA draft for sure, where he is a second round pick at best. Kind of a skilled combo forward, but had a very disappointing stretch of play before his injury. Then I had Lamar Peters, who is a player who is very hyped up from like those summer skill camps. I think he won the MVP of whether it be Nike or the Adidas skill camp. And, he was pretty underwhelming for most of the year, kind of came on late and rejoined the starting lineup. He's someone who is also testing. Well, he's testing the draft waters, could be back next year for Mississippi State. And then the last two guys weren't like totally disappointing, but Matthew Fisher-Davis from Vanderbilt and Terry Larrier from UConn, both guys who the numbers were okay. Fisher-Davis's numbers went down, probably because of the loss of such a key piece like Luke Cornett, all that Cornett did for that team. But Vanderbilt was not very good. I was much lower on Vanderbilt than most, so this isn't taking me like too by surprise. But Fisher-Davis was certainly a disappointment with his numbers decrease, and then Terry Larrier was just kind of like a wild, kind of uncontrollable piece for UConn. I saw UConn fans constantly complaining about his play and his shot selection, and seeing him play in person, I definitely agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, I think those are some really good ones, Brad. Just there's so many guys. I was noticing at the high major level where you could definitely make a case that they were super disappointing. I think a lot of it comes down to your individual expectations going in. This was fun, man. We'll definitely put up, as we said, on Twitter, those lists for you guys. The podcast will be up. You can listen to it. You can follow along on our list if you guys really want to get fancy. So it should be fun. Brad, anything else you'd like to add? I've been spending my days either studying or monitoring the madness that is the Siena coaching search. Latest rumor has Jamion Christian involved. We'll see where that takes us.
That would be a good hire. I had seen a rumor that Christian was going to leave Mount St. Mary's to go on. I think Shaka Smart's staff at Texas.
That was a rumor, and then there was also the rumor, and this is something I've heard from a couple of different people that wasn't just like kind of a rumor. I thought I just like sourced up information. That Christian had the job at FIU, and then things fell through due to contract structure. A couple of people speculated to me that was due to how long his contract is. I believe he's under contract until like 2027 at Mount St. Mary's. No one really knows what the buyout situation is there. I'm sure he didn't sign himself to something he can't get out of. But perhaps FIU didn't want to pay that full buyout, or they wanted Jamion to pay part of the buyout. Whatever happened, he did not wind up at FIU. That job went to Jeremy Ballard. So there are 4 jobs still on the table. But Christian is the rumor. There were some brief connections of Will Brown to Siena, which would have been funny as hell, coming from Albany, crosstown rival. That doesn't look like it's happening at this point, but you never know. Certainly some more names that could come into the mix. Some high major assistants, some sitting head coaches who have at least had some discussions about Siena. We'll see where that takes us. They're coming down to the wire. I'd expect a decision either end of this week or early next. They kind of have to get to work. Siena's had now their top 3 freshmen this season. Jordan Horn, Roman Penn, and Prince Oduro have all asked for their releases to at least look around. Penn had an excellent freshman season as a point guard, averaged 9 points a game, 10 points a game, season 5 rebounds, 3 assists. Oduro, 9 points and 5 boards. Heard from several schools already. He's likely gone. Jordan Horn, 8 points a game, an elite shooter. Him and Penn, I would say, have a very good chance of returning, depending on the new coach. But this is the risk when you go as long as they have on a coaching search. Of kids just have to look around, get that release so they can look around.
So, who do you think is more unlucky in terms of transfers between Andy Toole from Robert Morris, Nick McDevitt, who's now at Middle Tennessee but was previously at UNC Asheville, or Jamion Christian at Mount St. Mary's?
I'll go with the consistent hits of Andy Toole, just because it kind of like derailed his entire career. Like when you were looking at a guy like Nick McDevitt, he was still able to just like find new dudes every year who were studs.
he just lost a couple of guys. Robert Morris loses like significant portions of their roster to like Iona. Like when you're losing like your superstar player to a MAC school, that's kind of a tough thing to swallow. Jamie recruits extremely well. He'd do a really good job at Siena, as I mentioned. But he lost guys to Texas. We'll see Miles Wilson at Miami. We'll see Elijah Long at Texas. We saw Maudo Sol at Kansas State this year. He'll head back to the mid-major levels for Radford. All three coaches have really been screwed, though. Who do you take as kind of our parting shot of the pod?
I think I might have to go Christian. It is worth noting though that Andy Toole lost their like future center to Michigan State to be a walk-on. So that's a really tough blow. But I mean, Christian, the fact that he was even considering going from a head coach to an assistant kind of speaks to, well, I mean, this is total speculation, but I mean, he might just be sick and tired of losing his best players every year between, Wilson, Long, and they have a kid this year, Jonah Antonio, who's on the market, who averaged double figures as a redshirt freshman. So maybe it was just one too many hits at Mount St. Mary's.
Yep, and that will wrap us up. Jamie on Christian, we'll see where that goes. Thanks for listening to our surprises and disappointments. Thanks for listening despite our forgetfulness when I'm blanking on names. Each one of us had a little mishap, but we rallied and recovered through. So thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you guys enjoy your weekend. Get outside. I think it's going to be sunny most of the country. I know it's going to be nice out here in Evanston. Don't know how it's going to be up in the Northeast, Brad, but hope it's nice and everyone can enjoy some spring days. Have a good one, everybody.